Welcome to folks who are trickling in. We have quite a few folks registered for this webinar, so I'll just wait another minute for that attendee count to come up, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we're going to continue to see that participant count climb. This webinar did sell out, but rest assured we are recording this and we will be making that recording available after this webinar. So I'll go ahead and get us started, as we do want to make sure we have as much time as possible for the audience Q&A and the panel discussion. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the ARCCA and CAF joint webinar series. My name is Julia Kim. I'm the Director of Climate Change and Energy Programs with the Local Government Commission, or LGC, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. And today's webinar will feature a state panel discussion with officials from the California Natural Resources Agency, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Strategic Growth Council, and the California Department of Public Health. We'll be exploring community resilience in the context of climate change and COVID-19. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic is not the only crisis that our communities are facing. Throughout California and the nation, people are mobilizing to protest the systemic racism, oppression, and violence that Black Americans have been subjected to for centuries. While I'm not personally equipped to moderate such a discussion, we do hope that many of you are finding ways to hold space to have these difficult yet critical conversations with your colleagues and communities. With that, I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a moment of silence for the Black, Brown, and Indigenous lives lost due to past and ongoing injustice. Thank you. And I'll provide a brief overview of the California Adaptation Forum. As I noted, this webinar is the first of a four-part series being jointly organized by the California Adaptation Forum, or CAF, and the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCCA. As many of you know, the in-person CAF has been postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're still trying to figure out what that new date will be, but as soon as we have those details finalized, you can expect to receive an announcement on the new dates and the location for the next in-person CAF. I also want to take a moment to thank the Southern California Association of Governments, Resources Legacy Fund, California Coastal Conservancy, Beneficial State Foundation, and Beneficial State Bank for sponsoring this virtual series. Without their support, this webinar would not be possible, so thank you to all of our sponsors. And with that, I'll invite Phil Gibbons, who is ARCCA's 2020 chair, to provide a brief overview of ARCCA for those who may not be familiar with us.
All right, well, thank you, Julia. As Julia said, my name is Phil Gibbons, and I'm currently serving as the chair of ARCCA in 2020. I'm also a board member on the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. So that's my volunteer work. And then I'm employed by the Port of San Diego, where I work on energy, sustainability, and climate issues in a port setting. For those of you who don't know about ARCCA, ARCCA is a network of 7 regional climate collaboratives and affiliate members working to advance climate adaptation here in our state in California. We're facilitated, of course, by the Local Government Commission, and the Office of Planning and Research in California has been a great ally of ours and our state liaison to many state agencies in California. Our membership includes over 250 individual organizations representing a broad range of entities from government agencies, utilities, private businesses, academia, nonprofit groups, research, and philanthropy. ARCCA's core mission really is to provide a statewide forum where our collaboratives can share best practices and leverage each other's expertise to develop regional and community resilience in the face of climate change. And so hosting discussions like we're gonna have today is something that we do. We're really excited to kick off our learning session for 2020. You know, our theme entering this year, 2020, and in fact, this entire decade really is this transition from assessment to adaptation. In other words, making that shift from not only understanding the risks that climate change pose to us. Many of us have done that type of work, but really building resilience and actual adaptation, so doing something about it. And that doesn't mean just putting in infrastructure. Adaptation is bigger than that. It's about updating our governance, updating our policies, the regulatory environment. It means developing new financial mechanisms to actually deploy that infrastructure. It also means creating an equitable and inclusive environment for our community stakeholders to have a voice when it comes to climate change. So it's really a paradigm shift that focuses on new systems and creating resilience for our communities. And now, you know, as we've seen over the past 80 days or so, we've seen what disruption looks like. Community resilience is really important. And hopefully today we're going to learn about how addressing climate can aid in the post-COVID and economic recovery that we're going to need to be a part of. So we're really excited today to be joined by a great panel of state leaders. I want to thank them in advance for sharing their time with us and letting us into your homes, if that's where you are today. And I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Thanks so much, Phil. I think by now everyone is probably more of an expert on Zoom than I am, but I'll cover a few quick logistics before we dive in. So as you probably have noticed, everyone is muted except for our panelists due to the large number of participants that we have today. And we hope that you'll engage in the discussion by submitting questions for our panelists through the Q&A module. And please do feel free to submit questions at any time. And we'll also be asking folks to use the upvoting feature. As you know, if you see a question coming in from another participant that you're really interested in seeing a response to, please do upvote that, as we'll try to take those questions in order of interest. And there is also a hand raising function. So after you submit a question, and if you'd like to ask that question verbally, please do feel free to raise your hand. And as we get to your question, I can go ahead and allow you to speak and to unmute yourself. We also encourage you to use the chat function to engage with your peers, as well as to reach LGC staff if you encounter any technical issues. I'm joined today by Amber McGarvey with LGC, so please do feel free to reach out to either of us if you encounter any issues. And as I noted, if you, for folks who are not able to access this webinar, and in case you want to see it again or share it with your colleagues, we are recording this and we'll be making this available on the ARCCA website as well as the CAF website. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. We have Secretary Wade Crowfoot, who was appointed California Secretary for Natural Resources by Governor Gavin Newsom in January 2019. Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of 19,000 employees charged with protecting and managing California's diverse resources. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, for joining us. We also have Director Kate Gordon, who has spent the past 2 decades working at the intersection of climate change, energy policy, and economic development. Gordon was appointed Director of Governor's Office of Planning and Research and Senior Advisor to the Governor on Climate by Governor Gavin Newsom on January 7, 2019. Thank you, Director Gordon, for joining us. We're also joined by Louise Bedsworth, who's the Executive Director of the Strategic Growth Council, a state agency that brings together multiple agencies and departments to support sustainable communities, emphasizing strong economies, social equity, and environmental stewardship. And prior to joining the Strategic Growth Council, Director Bedsworth was a Deputy Director of the Office of Planning and Research in Governor Jerry Brown's office. So thank you, Director Bedsworth, for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Dr. Mark Starr, who was reappointed by Governor Newsom in 2020 as the Deputy Director for Environmental Health in the California Department of Public Health. And since 2012, he has led the Center for Environmental Health, which encompasses food and drug safety, cannabis safety, radiation safety, and environmental management programs, as well as supporting laboratories. So these are very brief bios. I know that each of our panelists bring quite a bit of expertise. So thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. And we are trying something new. This is going to be a full-on panel discussion format. We'll be turning it over to the audience for questions as quickly as we can. And just to kick us off, the current COVID-19 situation has undoubtedly devastated many, not just in California, but across the nation and world. It has also illuminated detrimental health, racial, and social inequities, inequities that marginalized populations have been burdened with long before the pandemic. In light of this reality, and with climate change continuing to accelerate, we know we need to create a new normal that prioritizes community resilience. So just to kick off the conversation, I'm hoping we can each share your hopes for what this new normal could look like. And I also invite you to share any welcoming remarks that you would like to. And maybe we can take it in order of how we did the introductions. So with that, I'm actually going to take my video off and I will turn it over to you, Secretary Crowfoot.
Hey, thanks so much, Julia, and thanks to ARCCA and LGC for organizing this. It's good to be with all of you. Sounds like several hundred people in this strange new sort of virtual reality conference environment we now find ourselves in. I'm really gratified that ARCCA is still advancing its work and gaining momentum on all things resilience. I had the opportunity to work in Governor Brown's administration when ARCCA was just sort of forming in its embryonic form, and it's great to see it institutionalized in the partnership with LGC. Most of all, I hope everybody is healthy and safe, and really it's been a remarkable spring, and I do want to reflect on that. On the one hand, I don't think any of us back in February would contemplate just the damage of the global pandemic that we continue to combat. The lives it's taken, the health it's impacted, and of course its economic toll. A lot of us in this conference today have spent a lot of time thinking about resilience and community resilience, primarily through the lens of impacts from climate change, be they wildfires or droughts or floods or sea level rise, extreme heat. But I can say honestly that I had not contemplated what it would mean to build resilience against a global health pandemic. Like others have, no doubt, Mark and Department of Public Health. And from my perspective, the COVID pandemic, I think sort of three sort of key takeaways for me anyways that are relevant to this discussion on resilience. One is, it has shined a very bright light on continued inequity that we have in our medical system, in our healthcare and social safety net. We know that communities of color are being impacted and folks from those communities are dying at a higher rate than the white community. We know that many disadvantaged communities don't have the resources to combat the spread like other communities. I guess that's number one. Number two, the importance and the centrality of public health in discussions of resilience. I think that's been a movement within on climate topics, is to integrate public health more centrally, but obviously COVID has brought just the importance of a public health infrastructure to the fore. And then the third is just the importance of science in decision making. We talk a lot about that in the context of climate resilience, but science needs to drive the response to COVID. And I'm grateful to say, thanks to leadership in California, it really is. But we're seeing the same distrust in science and COVID that we have in the world of climate. So obviously that's one crisis, and then obviously the second crisis Julia has mentioned is just the once again systemic racism and police brutality rearing its head, and add George Floyd and Christian Cooper to the long list of Black Americans that have been endangered or killed for doing things that a lot of us take for granted in our everyday lives. And very justified rage and pain across the country, I think, has put us all in a very both sort of raw emotional state, but also a really reflective one about what are we doing to be part of the solution. Because as the old adage goes, if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. So to me, it's a really solemn moment, but it's a moment that we have to think and talk and act to build resilience in more than ever. So I want to share, I think, directly to Julia's question, points of optimism that I take, or at least opportunities that I think we can take from the COVID crisis. And then I'll touch briefly on more broadly on the systemic racism. Really four kind of takeaways, or five takeaways, I should say, from opportunities from and lessons learned from COVID. One is we need to double down our investments in equity, recognizing that our communities are vulnerable when there are deep inequities and members of our community are vulnerable. Number two is, I think there are real opportunities to improve engagement and inclusivity of public decision-making. We've actually seen an uptick in participation in our public hearings and meetings because people can actually, during COVID, access those meetings via phone and computer. But it's really important that if we're going to use the virtual platform, that we do that in a way that's maximally accessible to everybody in our state. Number three is the importance of regionalism. I mean, ARCCA was founded based on a recognition that we experience climate risks differently across the state. And this COVID response demonstrates that actually resilience is really exercised and built locally. We have a situation where some communities their economic activities are coming back more quickly than others. So the importance of a regional approach. Number four, the fact that we know we're going to have to make investments to restart the economy, gain momentum back, jobs, et cetera. And just the importance of making those investments in ways that build our broader climate resilience is critical, that multi-benefit aspect. And then fifth is just finding ways to work better. State government was not a leader in remote working prior to the pandemic, but I have to say we moved most of our staff, certainly all that we could, probably well over 100,000 employees to remote working. And for the most part, it's worked pretty well. Likewise, we've moved to electronic signatures, which was sort of a halting movement in state government, moved almost entirely within our agency to that. And then number three is exercising flexibility with grantees and partners and figuring out ways to actually get things done that are a little less prescriptive from the state government perspective. So I think those are 5 areas of opportunity. I have another set of opportunities, I think, that comes out of this recognition just on the racism and police brutality, but I'll hold off and be glad to answer those in question and answer. Most of all, Julia, thanks for the opportunity for all of us to join today.
Thanks so much, Secretary Crowfoot. And Director Gordon, we'll pass it to you next.
Thanks so much, Julia. And just thank you, Phil, and all the work that ARCCA has done. We're so proud at OPR to be the state liaison, state facilitator for ARCCA. And I'm so proud that both Wade and Louise are OPR alums. So, you know, we're well represented on this call. Mark, we never got you at OPR, I don't think, but, you know, maybe there's time yet. So Wade, Secretary Crowfoot said a lot of really important points. And I think to underscore one of the things he said that can't be underscored enough is what COVID has demonstrated to us, even though we sort of already knew it, but it's really been stark, has been that we did not have a resilient system. Not resilient, not only in terms of resilience in the face of kind of extreme climate events, but also resilient economically, resilient in terms of social fabric. We just have seen the cracks in the system, and they have been highlighted by this crisis and continue to be highlighted. And that is incredibly challenging, but it also does offer up opportunities to really think differently about how we do this kind of work. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the kind of the high level climate resilience and economic resilience pieces. And I know Louise will likely focus in on more of the direct engagement with community, which is such an incredibly important part of the work that STC does. At a high level, you know, OPR, I would say over the last, you know, while I've been here, the last year and a half, and before that, we've been really focused on the need to move climate resilience and resilience more generally out of a side project and really into core mainstream operational decision making. How do we think about becoming more resilient as a core part of all of our operations, not as a kind of you know, just kind of a project that we focus on when it's convenient to focus on it. And I think that's particularly important because when we have a crisis like this, the thing that stops happening first tends to be the long-term planning that isn't sort of baked into the system, that doesn't seem as urgent, that doesn't seem as necessary. But as we know, if we don't do long-term planning particularly on things like climate resilience, we're looking at years and decades ahead of emergency response and frankly, a huge amount of money spent on emergency systems. So we do need to get ahead of these things. The question in our minds is always, how do we get ahead of them by incorporating them into the systems that exist in the state now and at the regional level, rather than just trying to infuse, kind of throw in the word resilience whenever we can. And a couple places where we're doing that and thinking about doing that. One is, of course, OPR does a lot of work on the general plans with regional and local governments, and general plan guidance is increasingly incorporating climate resilience as a core part of planning. So we are working right now on our environmental justice guidance. It's going to come out likely at the end of this week, with a strong focus on the importance of community engagement and community resilience, and thinking through vulnerable communities in addition to traditionally defined disadvantaged communities when we think about not just income, but also vulnerability to climate events, and how do those two things intersect. So that's become kind of a core part of our thinking on the environmental justice guidance. Same with we've been asked by the legislature to do wildfire technical assistance to general plans. And of course, the wildfire assistance is full of the issues of resilience, and really trying there to move beyond kind of immediate preparation and immediate recovery to how do we think further ahead about entire regions, as Wade said, of the state that are less resilient today, and how do we think about prioritizing resources and prioritizing technical assistance there. We do a lot of work in that realm in conjunction with our partners at CAL FIRE and the Office of Emergency Services. The governor last fall passed an executive order that actually the goal of which is to make resilience and climate action part of our kind of everyday activities as a state. Executive Order 1919 called for the state to be a really forward-looking and best-in-class investor and asset owner across our pension funds, and also our big systems where we own assets, like our transportation system and our Department of General Services. We've been doing an enormous amount of interagency work to put that into operation and to think through what does it mean to think about climate risk and resilience at the beginning of, for instance, a highway project or a bridge project or a grade separation or a active streets, active transportation project, instead of doing an entire project and then realizing that, for instance, it's in an area of high sea level rise, or that the materials you used on the road are vulnerable to extreme heat. So thinking about these things ahead of time in the way we do operations, integrating them in a mainstream way in our operations. And then on Department of General Services, the 19 million square feet of office buildings we own, the 51,000 fleet vehicles, how do we think about incorporating our climate goals, and particularly around resilience, into those? Those are all ongoing efforts, and I would say all under the heading of sort of, how do we make this part of everyday business? And that's frankly where the private sector is going. A number of companies are just starting to incorporate climate risk as a basic material risk to their operations, and looking across their supply chains and looking at their assets and thinking about how do they make sure that those are more resilient, and how do they make sure they're doing best in class work on low carbon resilient infrastructure. I think we can learn a lot actually from the private sector here. The last two things I'll say quickly. One is, I think everyone on the call knows that we're in a serious budget situation in the state of California, going from a $6 billion surplus in the governor's January proposed budget to a projected $54 billion deficit in the May revision. It's a incredibly dramatic swing. We're all reeling from it. We're all trying to figure it out every day. It will have significant impacts on what we're able to spend on and how we're able to spend. One of the things that we're doing even more than we were before, and really the governor has focused on in his public speaking, is looking at the federal government and thinking about federal opportunities to really enhance our programs, plus up our programs through federal dollars. And in that context, we've been working with our partner states at the U.S. Climate Alliance to really think through how do we again infuse climate resilience in particular into conversations about a federal stimulus and a federal infrastructure approach. And how do we think about, something that every single state across the country is focused on, which is becoming better able to withstand massive disruptions, whether those are from the pandemics, whether they're from climate events, whether they're from social disruption of any kind. How do we think about better managing disruption, and how do we build that into our systems and take a systems approach at the federal level as well? And I'll say, The transportation reauthorization bill that is going through the Senate right now and will likely be part of an infrastructure bill at the federal level is actually very focused on climate resilience. There's an entire underlying kind of agenda of that bill of making sure that those are resilient investments. It's a very bipartisan approach, actually, because so many states are dealing with really critical impacts to their transportation infrastructure. The final thing I want to say, and kind of in the vein of what Wade was saying about resilience being more than climate, one thing that the governor has prioritized, and we all spend a lot of time thinking about, is how do we make sure that all of these things we're talking about, the investments, the systems, are done in a way that we call high road, build a high road economy that really create good jobs with pathways into those jobs that create opportunity, that are inclusive, so that what we're not doing is just grafting a bunch of systems onto a system that's already broken in terms of inequality and access. How do we actually try to marry those two things and think about a more resilient system that's more resilient economically as well as more resilient to climate impacts? That's a huge priority across the state, and something that I think that you'll see reflected particularly now in the governor's Jobs and Economic Recovery Task Force, where that's kind of risen to the top as a really important set of priorities. How do we think about climate? How do we think about equity? How do we think about building out a high road economy that's stronger and more resilient than what we're leaving behind? So I'll stop there. Lots of concepts to get through there, and I think turn it back to Julia.
Thank you, Director Gordon. And Director Bedsworth, we'll turn it to you next.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julia and ARCCA and LGC. We, of course, also enjoy partnering with you on a number of our technical assistance programs and other partnerships. So I'll just build a little. I think we've heard quite a bit. Okay, this is really embarrassing. Someone just knocked on my door. I'm gonna run and get this.
This is working from home. I had to go into my kitchen a minute ago and tell my daughter to stop using the blender. So
everyone will be happy to know the Bedsworth dogs are home from their play date. So sorry for that interruption. So I was going to start with really talking about resilience, as I like to think of resilience quite a bit as a systems approach. And so I think we can't underestimate the importance, of course, of being ready for climate change, but ultimately how our physical resilience fits with our social and economic and community systems is central. So if we can have the strongest infrastructure in the world, but if we don't have the people to use it to go to work, to recreate, to do all of the things that we do, it's not going to matter. So taking that really systems approach is incredibly important. And I think what we're seeing right now is what happens when you have weaknesses in your social systems, and you're seeing the inequities play out in COVID-19, but just generally in the systemic racism and discrimination that we have across the country and in our systems. So as I look beyond COVID-19, and I think we all, are trying to think about what that will look like, I think there's a few things that are really important and principles that we start to think about how to embed in our work that can really help to build that resilience. And a lot of this is stuff that we've been trying to do at SGC, and this is not to say by any means we're doing it perfectly, but I think we have had an incredible opportunity working with all of our member agencies and all of our partners and with communities on the ground to try new integrated approaches to how we're doing the work that we do. So I'll just talk about a few of those. And I think that, we're already seeing tangible positive outcomes coming from the application of these principles. One is leading with community voices. And so as we think about designing solutions, we're designing them with communities, not for communities. And this means empowering stakeholders, community-based organizations, regional organizations, and others to feed up into the process. And so bringing together the top-down, if you will, state goals with community vision and community values and principles and needs. Of course, implementing policies that center equity. This is incredibly important as we think about the work that we do, ensuring that the people who are in place and the businesses who are there benefit from the work that we're doing, and that they're not pushed out because of this, and that causing that further disruption in our social systems and economic systems. And so I think that comes from doing what Kate was just talking about, is how do we embed and integrate economic development, workforce development, alongside all of these other investments that we're doing. And so thinking in that integrated way, you can ensure that the benefits are translating down to the people and the places. Another is partnership is incredibly important. And we have seen this, especially in our affordable housing programs, which is how do you instill partnerships? And that is across housing developers and transportation providers, with program providers and others, so that as you make an investment, you're investing in a place, but also in a system that is going to support the residents there, whether that is to help them get from home to a job, safely get from home to school, to healthcare services. All of those things are brought together, and you're able to take an integrated approach. You don't have to hop around looking for different sources of funds, but you're also really building that partnership in from the beginning. And so I think this all really speaks to taking a pretty holistic and systemic approach to our planning and our investment. And this is, I think, increasingly important in times of diminished budgets, and where we need our dollars to go further. So we need to ensure that, of course, we all would like to see, and we know we need additional investment to build resilience. But the fact is, every dollar we spend should be a resilience dollar. So we should be thinking about that, as we do everything that we do. And through doing that, we can take advantage of the synergies that exist, but also identify the conflicts. And if we can't resolve those, at least be able to address them up front. I think another really important tool that that we have seen incredible success with, and I think is really continuing to evolve, and a number of state agencies and departments are deploying, is technical assistance. And technical assistance can mean a lot of different things, from building up local capacity and community-based organizations, to facilitating partnership development, to helping with application writing, to access funds. We've got program-specific technical assistance and place-based technical assistance. So there's so many ways that for actually a fairly small relative investment, we can be building the capacity of communities and others to start implementing more resilient principles, to access funds and resources to do the work of resilience. And so overall, I think the biggest thing for me, and something we've been working on for quite a while, is as we look ahead, we're not just planning investing for a different future, which we know we will have, but that we're planning and investing differently. And so we're building these principles and approaches into how we do the work. We're building in more flexible approaches. We're building in partnership, and we're thinking in integrated ways. And so as I look out to thinking about a more resilient California post-COVID-19, I'm hoping that we will see some of those principles start spreading throughout all of our programs at the state, and then ideally as we're thinking about using federal dollars and in our partnerships with local governments. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Bedsworth. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Starr, we'll turn it to you before we dive into the audience Q&A.
Thank you, Julia. I always enjoyed the last but not least role. Thanks for the invitation and opportunity from ARCCA and LGC to be here. I'll mention quickly that in addition to being the Deputy Director for Environmental Health, I've been the acting deputy for our Office of Health Equity in the Department of Public Health since August, and that probably has as much bearing on my comments today as anything. The Office of Health Equity is actually where our climate change and health program is headquartered in our department, and has also of course been quite engaged in the pandemic response because of the disparities that the pandemic has highlighted. I'll mention a little bit more about the pandemic itself because I work in public health, and that's something that may be of interest to folks, and then get specifically to the question about what the new normal could be for climate resilience and how the parallels with the infections, the pandemic infectious disease outbreak. I'll start by just commenting that I appreciate in the question the key word of new as we talk about creating a new normal in terms of community resilience. What has been normal hasn't really worked in many cases for many people. And in our Office of Health Equity, we really focus on promoting equitable social, economic, and environmental conditions to achieve optimal health and well-being for all Californians. We do this mostly through what we call upstream public health work that focuses on changing underlying policies, systems, and environments. So we refer to these as social determinants of health. And so it's not just behaviors that we hear about with affecting people's health and what they eat and things like that, but also the environmental and social conditions where people live, work, and play that can impact their health. And we've certainly seen that with COVID-19, with the pandemic. We've seen that communities that are hardest hit by the pandemic and the associated economic impacts of the closures of the economy are often the same ones hardest hit by climate change impacts. So that overlap, I think, is key to where we can move forward from this. These populations have already faced disproportionate inequities, institutional racism, community disinvestment, poor living and environmental conditions, and difficult access to services, as many of you know. So leading to health disparities, premature deaths, and particularly in lower socioeconomic groups. So all these things, including environmental justice and the potential more exposure to air pollution, all these things make these populations and communities more vulnerable to additional health harms. And so it is regional, as Wade mentioned, and these inequities are not universal across California, and some areas are much worse than others as far as the impacts. But whether the health impacts are from COVID-19 or climate related or other disasters, they hit the same populations quite often. Just for a few kind of updates on race and other demographics for the pandemic, you're probably well aware that the death number of deaths, proportion of deaths in different populations has varied with the pandemic. And so for African Americans, Latinos, and to smaller numbers, but the Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have all had deaths from coronavirus out of proportion to what one would expect for their proportion of the population. And so one of our endeavors has been to better understand that as we work on the pandemic, and we have obviously all hands on deck in our department to address this, and that these equity issues and differential impacts are part of that and very important. There's a number of potential explanations, including that many of these individuals are more likely to be essential workers and service workers. They may be in more dense living conditions or even unhoused, and those things would increase their exposure to the virus. They probably are more likely to have underlying health conditions that can put them at risk for more severe disease, such as hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and the like. And there's, of course, lifetime stress and adversity that's important as well. And lastly, there's a decreased access to health services and healthcare, and including testing, as we've seen through the pandemic. So all these things have resulted in differential impacts across our population and especially our communities of color. So learning from the language used, the Movement Strategy Center, we look at this as an opportunity to bounce forward from the pandemic. We're not looking to just bounce back to the way things were, and many of the panelists before me have talked about the opportunities we have to move some of the things forward that the pandemic has highlighted that we could improve, whether it's teleworking, fossil fuel consumption reductions, and many other things at a community level as well. We don't want to just go back to those underlying conditions of inequitable power and participation in decision making. Instead, we want to bounce forward to that new normal, one that includes healthy, clean, and sustainable economy and inclusive participation in policy and planning. At CDPH, we're seeing some key lessons that are climate and health related from the pandemic. One simple one is that we're all only safe and healthy as our neighbors are. And we're seeing that, of course, even more so now with some of the situations in our country because of racial inequities and discrimination. All of our neighbors, whether they're driving buses, serving food, cleaning hospital bathrooms, in immigrant detention centers, and so on, and also includes our neighbors around the world. Many of the individuals have already started in a more precarious position before the pandemic and already dying each year from impacts of the fossil fuel economy. Another lesson, of course, is the public health infrastructure. We've been planning for pandemics for probably at least 12 to 15 years. And we've been dealing with smaller pandemics for a long time before that. But no amount of planning could have prepared us for the resources and the response that was needed. And investing resources up front in public health infrastructure will save lives. Along with that, structural change and government planning are needed. You know, private entities and the just-in-time supply chain in the healthcare sector, for example, we've seen simply were not enough in the face of a pandemic. And the same is true for climate and health. We've also seen that financial assistance can have bipartisan support, even in our current political climate, when the threat is widely understood. And that's an area in climate change domain that I think we need to get to, be able to have bipartisan support for that kind of financial assistance. And of course, we've seen inspiring grassroots examples of mutual aid and neighbor-to-neighbor support all the way down to the community level. And just the importance of community connectedness has been highlighted by the pandemic. And it'll be important as we address climate change and its health impacts. So responding to the pandemic by improving the living conditions, economic security, and health status, all of our communities can also build community resilience to climate change. Many of the strategies that strengthen public health prevention and preparedness also facilitate climate change preparedness. So active transportation, urban greening, local food systems, energy efficiency, healthy homes, all those things that many of you are familiar with. We'll hope to leverage the recovery to sustain decreases in fossil fuel use seen during the pandemic, increase the transition to renewables in order to mitigate climate change, but also improve health outcomes, particularly for all of our populations that are experiencing inequities, are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Starr, and to all of our panelists. We have quite a few questions coming in, so I'm going to see how many we can cover in the time that we have so we can get folks out on time. So for this next question, I'll actually combine two related questions that came in. So the first is from Natalie Hernandez, who's with Climate Resolve. She asks, what are things each of your state agencies are committing to uplift voices from Black, Indigenous, and people of color? For example, appointing leaders of color in your organization, tailoring outreach to reach these groups, partnering with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or thinking about the distribution of funding. And we have a related question from Ami Raval, who's with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and she is asking, how do your agencies plan to explicitly address racial justice and the disproportionate and simultaneous burdens from COVID-19 and climate change, specifically on working class communities of color? Difficult questions during these difficult times, but definitely curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first, and we should spend a lot more time on answering that question, but let me give some high-level thoughts. You know, first, as leaders of governmental agencies or institutions, we need to look within our own institutions and recognize that they were built, you know, with unconscious bias and you know, the systemic racism that has kind of plagued our society. And so we have to challenge ourselves to actually embody, you know, the principles we want to see within our own institutions. So it includes certainly, as the question indicated, you know, recruiting, empowering, elevating, promoting diverse leaders that look like California. State government, 220,000 person workforce, maybe compared to a lot of companies, is fairly racially and ethnically diverse, but certainly does not fully reflect the diversity of California. That's something that the governor understands and that we in agencies are actively working to change. Secondly is to listen and learn. And if we're reforming our institutions, it's also, you know, reflecting on our own limitations and this unconscious bias that we have. Many entities within our Natural Resources Agency have engaged in a program that I know Louise will know the acronym for, which is essentially the capital cohort focused on economic equity and racial justice. Probably just, you know, totally got that name wrong. Louise, what is it again?
Well, it's the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, and then we have the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity, which is the maturation of the capital cohort. So
yeah, so the point is actually listening and learning about what we need to do within our own institutions and from people that you know, experience the world very differently than we do. For our agency, it's really institutionalizing environmental justice in a way that we haven't before. I'm pleased to share that we're establishing our first Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Equity. And in our agency anyways, we really haven't built out a living, breathing, integrated environmental justice program to make sure like our decision-making is taking equity into account at all levels. So we're eager to do that. And then I think just in, you know, each of us within our own areas has to think about what does it mean, this equity lens, the so-called California for all, you know, frame that really animates what Governor Newsom does. How do we actually reflect that in our own policies? So for us in Natural Resources Agency, it's really about expanding access for all Californians to be able to get outdoors and in a safe and comfortable way, enjoy outdoor spaces, parks, but also cultural institutions across the state. So I think this is the beginning of the discussion, and I'm looking forward to really being held accountable by you know, groups that have this expertise to really use this as a moment to continue to reform the institutions and bring in new leadership.
I mean, I'll jump in quickly. I think so. SGC several years ago partnered with Race Forward to bring GARE to the state agencies. I know several departments had gone before, actually working. The Department of Public Health and Housing and Community Development have actually done this for longer in doing this racial equity training with a focus on government agencies. And so we have been participating in that, and I'm very proud to say we adopted a racial equity action plan. Our council, chaired by Kate Gordon there, and which Wade is a member of as well, adopted our racial equity action plan in April of 2019. And so we have been working hard at work to implement that, and that cuts across all parts of our operation, from how we do our programs to how we think about contracting into how we do hiring. And so we've been touching on that in a number of ways. We have had a couple of very specific initiatives this year. One was doing a tribal set aside in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, and received our first application from a tribal housing authority in this round. And we've been working on that for years, and that's been through specific technical assistance, outreach, and partnership. We focus a lot of our programs on serving and reaching under-resourced communities. We have a new program we're getting up underway, which will be doing leadership training and for community leadership in under-resourced communities. It's the implementation of Senate Bill 1072. And then we also have moved to an anonymized hiring process, which has actually, where we're anonymizing all applications. We've made very concerted efforts to do much broader outreach for all of our job postings, and we're seeing a much more diverse pool of candidates coming in and new staff coming in. And so it's a start. There's a lot more that we need to do, but it has been a tremendous focus of ours. And I think the more recent events that have been coming up have just renewed, I think, our commitment around this, as well as the conversations that we're having at SGC and also with OPR, because we are all co-located. And so we're doing this work together, and we'll continue to participate in GARE, which is now CORE. but with OPR and SGC together. But it's a great question, and one I think that people should keep asking us, because there is a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in, I guess, if that's okay, Kate. In the Department of Public Health, a lot of what we do is to address inequities, and has been since public health began almost in many ways. My work in public health goes back almost 30 years, and we've worked on things like Black infant health and HIV/AIDS and sexually transmitted diseases. There's so many things that are inequitably distributed in our population that we work on from a public health level. And so our department somewhat reflects some of those populations, but in many ways doesn't, and we certainly recognize that. And we as Louise mentioned, we were one of the leaders in implementing the Governmental Alliance on Race and Equity in California at the state level. But also, more importantly, within CDPH, we have a racial and health equity initiative that has broadly about 9 goals, I think. And some of the first ones that we've worked on that are most important are in the areas of recruitment and retention, trying to have a workforce that, as Wade mentioned, looks more like the rest of California. We also have an internal training program that we're piloting in one of our centers. And so we've done quite a bit in that area, trying to get that ball rolling. We also, as I mentioned, of course, have an Office of Health Equity, and this has been a priority for our department for the last 8 years. And with our new director, Dr. Angel, one of the reasons she came to California was actually because of our health equity presence in the Department of Public Health. And she strongly supports that, and strongly supports climate change and health aspects as well. And finally, addressing racism as a public health problem. Our scope goes beyond some of the areas we might think of as traditional public health, and that's certainly one of them.
Thanks, Mark. I'll be super quick because I know we have a lot of questions coming in. And this is, as Wade said, something we could and should be talking about the entire day. But reinforcing what Louise said, we've been incredibly fortunate to have the relationship we have with SGC, who's been really leading on these issues. For the state, I just want to put a pin on 2 things. One is the anonymizing of applications. I just really agree with Louise, and one thing that we're doing that at OPR as well, and we're anonymizing both names and schools that people attended, which is really, really important when it comes to thinking through sort of economic access and kind of there's a lot of unconscious bias around schools that people went to. We don't always think about it, but we tend to gravitate toward people who went to schools we know, or schools we know people at, or and so I think that's been really significant for us. The other thing that I wanted to point to, and this is sort of in my role also within the governor's office, is we've been doing a significant amount of work with the appointments folks, the folks in the appointments department, to work on boards and commissions in particular. We have an issue with boards and commissions in California where not only are they not particularly representative from a racial or ethnic standpoint, they're not particularly representative regionally. And to get to one of the important points that has been made a couple of times about regional disparities across the state, we have an incredible inequality between coastal and inland regions in this state in terms of philanthropy, in terms of private sector funding, in terms of availability of services and resources. And one thing we've spent a lot of time thinking about in this administration under the governor's leadership has been trying to address that and trying to really lift up voices from inland California on some of those kind of high-level boards and commissions, as well as in our state leadership. And I think that's actually really important as well. So I'll just leave it at those things. But again, there are so many more things we could be doing, and we could be talking about this for much longer.
Thank you all so much. I'm just going to keep this moving, see how many we can answer. So next up, this is an anonymously submitted question. Due to revenue shortfalls from the Q2 cap and trade auction, will the state continue to provide robust funding for green projects previously funded through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? How does the state plan to leverage additional funding to support disadvantaged communities with climate resilience measures?
Yeah, this is a hard one. Go ahead, Wade. You want to start to tackle it?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll jump in, which is, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which many know is generated by these cap and trade auctions, has developed into a really important resource for both pollution reduction, but also environmental equity. In part because it's provided very large amounts of resources each year, like billions of dollars. And obviously with COVID and the need to flatten the curve, the economy, as I think Thomas Friedman said, got put on a medically induced coma. And that impacted activity, which impacted and reduced pollution, which impacted the most recent auction. I think the most recent auction early last week, the week before, generated $24 million for the state. The previous auction had generated over $750 million. So we see, we are experiencing a significant shock to the resources that we have for GGRF, which is problematic given all of the important things that GGRF is funding, not only on pollution reduction, electrification, all that, but also disadvantaged communities and equity. And so I think it's an unresolved question around how the GGRF will recover, but then also, as the GGRF declines over time, which it's really designed to, as less and less pollution is emitted by stationary sources of pollution, what replaces it? I think we recognize to make the shift that we need to toward climate neutrality and deep community resilience, as well as environmental equity, we need scaled up resources. And GGRF, while it's been helpful, it's not going to be the silver bullet moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I just would echo that. I mean, we are anticipating, just looking at the hard numbers on economic recovery that our Department of Finance is putting in front of us, and that we used for the budget assumptions for the May revision, but also that others around the world are putting forward. I don't think anyone rational is expecting this to be what they call a V-shaped recovery, so that everything will just come back to the same levels that it was at before in terms of economic activity. There are so many businesses in California that are dependent on in-person, face-to-face interaction. About 60% of our economy is based on that kind of business, and there is a real question about what will come back and how, and just a real question about speed. So I think we are being honest with ourselves about next year's auctions and expecting them to come in at a much lower level. To Wade's point, the entire system was designed actually not as a revenue system, but as a system to bring down emissions. That's the point of the cap and trade program. It's been incredibly effective in combination with other policies at doing that. So in some ways, what we're having now is just like a very fast shock to a system that we would have had a shock to in any case. It's forcing us into thinking a lot more creatively, frankly, about how we run our existing programs to make sure that they support our climate goals. So instead of GGRF as a standalone pot of money over here in the budget, really thinking about how do we incorporate those goals throughout the rest of our budget and the rest of our decision making. Again, going back to that point about mainstreaming these things into our decision making process, it's making us, I think, be much more strategic. And I saw there was a question in the Q&A about federal funds and the federal deficit. It is true that there's a federal deficit. The federal government, unlike us, can print money and does not have a balanced budget constitutional requirement. So we still will be spending a lot of time looking at the federal government for support and backstop on a number of these types of programs. And it's also putting us in a position where we need to, I think, just think about other sources, and particularly for support for disadvantaged communities. Those types of funds tend to not ever be in the category where the private sector will pick them up. A lot of our technology investments, our infrastructure investments, we actually can do public-private matches. We can get the private sector to be much, much more engaged, and we need to do that because we cannot solve this alone. But those very targeted programs to disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, we are going to need to keep prioritizing, and we are going to need to keep finding federal funds, and government funds. The last thing I'll say is that in the May revision, you'll see the governor's budget has a priority on those types of programs for that exact reason, that these are the areas where we cannot afford to walk away, and we need to come up with, not only prioritizing our state funding for these programs, but also looking for alternative sources. And you know, I will not lie, this is a huge challenge for all of us here today, and will continue to be. And so we're spending a lot of time on this question.
All right, thank you both. The next question we have from another anonymous attendee. What is the state thinking of doing to support local governments to act now to promote continued remote work for jobs, thinking about their own employees and in their region where this makes sense, as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from commutes and improve quality of life?
Well, for what it's worth, again, I'll say that I think state government has had a bit of an aha moment with remote working as a result of the pandemic. And speaking for our agency, you know, remote working was very much the exception to the norm and required this fairly complicated legal agreement on remote working, et cetera. And in the move to protect people and reduce the transmission of the coronavirus, we moved very quickly collectively across agencies to where we could and for who we could enable remote working. And there are certain challenges to this. We're now seeing that people really want to be together, at least sometimes, to really build that camaraderie and maintain that energy. But for the most part, we've been able to maintain the mission, which is great. And so moving forward, we have several departments in our agency that are actually really thinking about what it means to provide much more flexibility for stay-at-home work. It may reduce our facility costs, our need to spread out departments over multiple buildings. And obviously it has an environmental benefit and reduced cars on the road. And of course, a quality of life benefit, particularly given that people are increasingly commuting very long distances. So I think our experience in state government has been really good. And we hope that local governments are likewise experiencing this. The question I'd ask in a very provocative way back to local governments is, what state help do you need? This would be an opportunity for local governments to also demonstrate leadership. I think I'd be open-minded to exploring what state support is needed, but from my perspective, and again, just being totally candid, I would say Godspeed. Local government does not need state government permission or resources to be able to empower your workforce to work remotely.
I mean, one thing I will add on that, which I would agree entirely for those of us, you know, who've been at the speed with which we've been able to adopt new technologies and new platforms to be able to share and connect with one another has been incredible. I'll just share an experience we had, which is we do a lot of work with communities, traveling all around the state. Our staff is on the road a ton, meeting with people. And I think we just had to conduct 4 half-day site visits, all via Zoom. And this has been as a key part of our Transformative Climate Communities program. And I think everybody was uncertain at the state level, at the local level, the community partners. And while it doesn't replace being there in person, it was exceptionally successful. We found ways that local governments did need support. We provided a lot of sort of, for lack of better words, sort of hand-holding to do that. I think some of the big challenges, and I think that the state is definitely thinking about, are access and broadband access and ensuring equitable access to the technology and the infrastructure that everybody needs to be able to work remotely, and recognizing there are communities that still are not served properly. And so I think that is a place where the state can step in and is you know, trying to look at that. And that's been an issue that's come up for years and years. And I do think that this pandemic has brought it again to the fore. This is an issue we need to take on. It's critical infrastructure, just the same way our roads and streets and, you know, water and all of that is. And so, so I think that's one that, you know, where there is probably a role for the state. And then I think there is just a process of mutual learning and becoming comfortable with it, which has been, I think we've all been thrown into it. And there's things that aren't going to work, but a lot of it does. And I think that's been really valuable, at least for us at the state level, but I think also for some of our local partners.
I'll just chime in a little bit. I don't want to divulge too much about my age, but I've been working in public health for quite a while, and at the county level as well, our local health department colleagues we work closely with. And in the 1990s, I actually participated in a telecommuting pilot at Sacramento County. And so I'll echo what Wade said. I mean, this pandemic, and not that much changed since 1990s as far as how teleworking and telecommuting is addressed in government organizations. And this pandemic has definitely brought it to the forefront. We've had to move quickly to get people some of the equipment that they need to be able to work at home, as Louise was mentioning, and make sure that's equitable across our staff. So it's been definitely an important step for us all. The other thing, in some of my programs are inspection-based, they're field programs. And so whether it's food safety or radiation safety or others, we've had to adjust what our field staff do so they have fewer interactions with others during the pandemic. And so we've learned to do different tools for remote inspections using modern technology. And so that's something that maybe all those things that we can hopefully share with our local health department colleagues. And when they go and inspect restaurants and grocery stores, for example, that's a local function. Perhaps they can do something along the lines that we've been able to set up with remote inspections. And we also have done risk-based inspections, so we prioritize the higher risk entities and defer the others.
So thanks, everyone. Our next question, another anonymous one here. How do we, this in terms of the whole slow streets movement, just asking how practitioners can support that, what the state can do to support that, an idea to require every town of a certain size to be encouraged or incentivized to try slowing a street. Any thoughts to share on that?
Well, first, I think it's an incredibly creative idea. I have the privilege of working with Gavin Newsom when he was mayor of San Francisco, and we copied the ciclovia concept originated in Bogota, Colombia, that so many others had adopted. The idea that you actually take the street and make it a place to recreate and to keep healthy. It's so brilliant because you're not finding new land, you're not building infrastructure, you're repurposing a street. And the way Mayor Schaaf in Oakland did it was, as I understand it anyways, a way to make the streets safe to actually get out and exercise while minimizing inconvenience on neighbors that still need to pull in their driveways, et cetera. So I think it's brilliant. I think the big question is, and I think that I know we've got a transportation secretary in David Kim that is really passionate about these creative ideas to allow communities to shift modes of transportation, however appropriate in that community. So I think that then the question is, let's say if state government thinks slow streets are a really good idea, can it provide carrots? Can it provide incentives or tools? And then I think, as the question inferred, would it create certain requirements? From my perspective, the more that mode shift is driven by locals and really tailored to the local community, the better. Because certainly mode shift and things like slow streets are not a one-size-fits-all. You look at like how the ciclovia concept, again, closing streets for recreation, has evolved. It looks very different in Los Angeles than it does in San Francisco. And so I just think that those ideas, those initiatives become most durable when they're driven locally. But I'm very supportive of doing whatever certainly we can to enable those types of actions.
Can you guys hear me? I had to switch to my headphones because my son is having his virtual piano lesson in the next room. So I wanted to really say also bravo on the small streets. I'm really proud that the transportation director of Seattle, which did it for 20 miles permanently, and then the transportation director for Oakland, who've done it temporarily for 72 miles, are both graduate school classmates of mine. So, I feel like I have a small part in both of those cities. But seriously, I think one of the things the slow streets movement points to is something that we know really well from polling that's been done in California and the work we've done at OPR and SGC, which is that Californians want to live in walkable communities. Californians want to live in places where there is community, where people can be out on their stoops. I think to Mark's point, we've seen a lot of resurgence of community and neighborhood engagement, interestingly, from the stay-at-home orders. And it's really, really important that we figure out ways to provide incentives for that across the board. It's the slow streets concept making sure that sidewalks are actually usable, which is another big piece of that on many streets that aren't able to be closed, making sure that we are providing housing near jobs, near services throughout California. Obviously, a huge part of what OPR focuses on is land use planning. And one of the things that we're paying a lot of attention to is this this concern, really misplaced concern, that that the COVID crisis will sort of become an anti-density crisis. There's a lot of stuff that's been written sort of anti-city, anti-density around the crisis, when the reality is that it isn't density that causes greater risk, it's really overcrowding. So we have very dense cities that have not had high COVID results, whereas less dense but overcrowded because of inequalities, cities that have had higher rates. So we need to be thinking about all these things together. And I think the key to me is, and it kind of goes to the last question too, how do we create a California with people having the most choices that they can have to be as engaged as they can be in their communities and in their places that they live? And that's a combination of teleworking where you can, but giving people access to get to their jobs where they can't telework, ensuring that people are not traveling 2 hours to get to their jobs, making sure that we have complete streets and active transportation priorities as part of our transportation planning, which is something that both Secretary Kim, but also Caltrans Director Tokso Bashakin, who's a bike ped activist from his prior life, are very focused on. So I think that it's a holistic systems answer, because what we don't, slow streets don't make sense in some places where people aren't on the streets because they're not walkable communities. So how do we think about all these things kind of together? But agree with Wade that it's a really inspiring movement, and I actually there aren't a lot of silver linings right now. And one of the things that I actually find really inspiring in general is just the neighborhood engagement and community engagement that people are rediscovering as a result of being at home and being confined to smaller areas. I think it's something that we need to figure out how to continue.
And Natalie, I noticed your comment around state grant programs, and I know this is not the same concept, but I would point to our active transportation programs, and also within transformative climate communities and affordable housing and sustainable communities programs at SGC, we fund a lot around how to make streets safer. And in many cases that can be, thinking about how we do bike lanes, how you do safe walking. And it may be, so it's really more of a complete streets concepts in many ways, or integrating safe active transportation options. So it's not the same in terms of taking a whole street, but it is definitely with a focus on how do you create those options and choices, how do you make them safe and attractive so that folks will use them. And that can be doing urban greening and planting street trees so that it's not an exposed hot sidewalk. It can be lighting and other things to help people feel, to increase safety and reduce crime. So I think it exists in a number of programs, and there's probably a way to look at that and how those could be fitting together to also capture some of the goals of the slow streets work that's been happening. I mean, I live in Oakland, and what they've done near Lake Merritt, which is a big urban amenity, and it was getting so crowded that the mayor kept saying, just give the lake a break, give the lake a break. But they've taken a lane of road, and so you can just spread out. So you've got sidewalk, you've got a lakeside pathway, and you've got a lane of the road. And so there's just a lot of ways to do this. And those are the kinds of things that you could fit into an active transportation program or some of our existing funding streams.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have 16 minutes left. I think we'll have time for maybe two more questions, which I'll flag in the Q&A module for everyone to see what we'll plan to cover. So this next question comes from Simone Cordery-Cotter. She's with the Sierra Business Council, also the Vice Chair for ARCCA for 2020, and also manages Sierra Camp, the regional collaborative in Sierra Nevada. So Simone is asking, how is the administration thinking about measuring economic resilience? We're seeing GDP and the stock market fail to take externalities like climate change and racial equity into account. Can we take advantage of this opportunity to measure our recovery more inclusively?
Yeah, that's
Well, it's a damn good question, and that's a tough answer. I mean, I would say, I think we would definitely agree with the problem statement, which is, traditional measurements of economic progress don't measure equity, and they don't measure sort of environmental quality. I know that in our state, under this governor, we are very much tracking certain equity indicators and the growing disparities of income and life outcomes. So I'm confident that we are measuring those indicators. There's probably a more integrated way to have them expressed. I think that the challenge as it relates to environmental quality is a little bit different, which is, or harder, or maybe not harder, but less evolved, in that how do we internalize, environmental damages that have been externalized. I think that continues to be a problem. In our natural resources area, we continue to confront a paradigm that suggests it's economic growth versus environmental protection. We know it's not, frankly, and we know that there are a lot of things that we can do to improve our economy and protect our environment. This is those multi-benefit sort of investments, green economic stimulus. That being said, Kate, you probably, or Louise, you know more about this than I do, but I don't know of a really good set of indicators that's truly like redefining our progress, on economic growth and recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and kind of stems from the problematic nature of our existing metrics. I mean, many people have written about the fact that GDP is not a good metric for anything. And just as a good example that'll be relevant to this conversation, after Hurricane Katrina, the GDP of Louisiana went down by several points, of course, because Louisiana had a massive dislocation and a huge amount of money spent on public assistance. The GDP of the United States actually went up as a result of Hurricane Katrina because of increased construction activity and flows of construction goods into Louisiana. So it's an important reminder that crises can actually look good. And you'll see this with the stock market too. That's another thing that we use as an indicator of economic health that's completely disassociated from people's everyday lived experience. Our poverty line, I mean, all kinds of existing metrics, which are old and outdated. And there's been an enormous amount of conversation about the need for a better set of metrics. I will say again that I think that where we're going as a state with something that isn't new, but I think is newly kind of relevant, which is this whole question of what is a high road economy. So really incorporating job quality, pathways into good jobs and good work, and sustainability and resilience into one sort of set of ideas around what it means to have an economy that's truly sustainable, an economy that's truly resilient and inclusive, is incredibly important. And each of those pieces has its own metrics. It's hard to kind of tie them up in a bow, but it's actually also important that they be considered together, because again, we could have the lowest carbon economy in the world with everyone living with poverty, with 90% of people living with poverty wages. And that would not be an inclusive, resilient, sustainable economy. We could have a fossil fuel driven economy where everyone is getting paid really, really good wages with great apprenticeship programs and training programs. And that would not be a resilient, inclusive, sustainable economy. So how do we think about these things together? The concept of high road economic growth does try to do that. And it's something that I think we as a state are embracing more proactively than we have been. We're thinking about how it applies to this recovery conversation, and we're producing metrics around each of those areas. I'll be honest and say that resilience is one of the hardest ones to do metrics around. It's much easier to talk about carbon emission reductions at a specific site from a specific action than it is to talk about the relative resilience of that place. But it also forces us to think about resilience in a much broader context, and I think that's a good thing.
Excellent, thank you both. All right, we have 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna go ahead and start to wrap things up. We'll take that final question at the top there, and maybe we'll do this in reverse order of the introductions. So I'll pass it first to you, Dr. Starr, then Director Bedsworth, Director Gordon, and then finally Secretary Crowfoot. If you could share a few closing thoughts with the hundreds of participants who have gathered today, and also share any thoughts on what resiliency looks like in everyday life for families in California. That'd be great. Dr. Starr?
Thank you. The experience we just had and are in the midst of with the pandemic and the other things going on in our society are certainly highlighting what we need to address with the various communities in order to sustain resilience. So I think the focus would be on health equity and equity in general across various socioeconomic groups, racial groups, and others, sexual orientation, and on and on. There's just much to be done with these areas. And so I think I would just say that we all have a lot to learn and sustain as we rebound and bounce forward, as I mentioned, from this pandemic, and hopefully to a more resilient world that is less climate impacts, and we're addressing climate change and health impacts more effectively. And I'll just say in my many years in public health, I really thought I understood health equity and some of these issues. And yet since August, I've been working closely with our Office of Health Equity, and it's been a lot to learn. And there's always more every day to understand the problems and how best to promote resilient communities going forward, whether it's from a pandemic or whether it's from climate change or other problems.
Thank you, Dr. Starr. And Dr. Bedsworth, we'll pass it to you.
Great. Well, thanks. And thank you all for these great questions and the good conversation. I mean, I think if you take this and you asked in sort of thinking about the life for everyday life for families in California, we were talking earlier this morning during our staff meeting, and one thing that has been so striking to me from from the pandemic is how so quickly our circle and our worlds became so small. We all moved back into our homes, you know, and maybe we have a few connections that we are making outside of that, and we're checking up virtually on our colleagues and our friends. But that has been really striking to me. And I think as we think about coming out of this, how we rebuild or reestablish, not even rebuild, but reestablish those connections, and also the ones that we know we're missing. Because I think what's going on right now around the racial equity issues and the unrest is showing the missing connections that we have and the missing pieces of this system. And so I hope that coming out of this, as we reestablish and rebuild, you know, our communities, and that's going to be both in our economic senses, but in our social connections and in our process, you know, in our processes and the way we do things that we're going to be addressing some of those gaps and some of those things that we know are missing, and thinking about how we are embedding equity and ensuring that everybody comes along as we come out of this pandemic. And I think, you know, to me, the hope is that we all are taking that in, and I can see it in my children, are seeing all of this happening and play out, and are wanting to take action, whether it's, you know, how they're going to get back to school with people, to, you know, trying to be out in the streets right now. And so that's just my hope, is that as we rebuild, I think we've had a real opportunity, for lack of a better word, to see those missing pieces, missing connections, and the inequities that we have to very consciously address as we come back out of the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Bedsworth. And Dr. Gordon.
Thanks, Julia. You know, I think as usual, Louise has said many of the things that I would say, so kudos and ditto to her. But I would also say, I think there's a few things that we've experienced during this pandemic that are actually give me hope. And, you know, people always ask when you work on climate change for a living, how you get up in the morning. And you know, it's these little things that kind of get you to keep going and think that this stuff can be moved forward and operationalized with hard work. And the things that give me hope, a couple things. One is we have seen that collective human behavior is really possible, that we can work collectively when responding to a crisis, and that we can have massive behavior change when it's necessary. And I think that's actually really important, because I, for one, was frankly getting really jaded and cynical about that possibility. And I think that's been amazing, that that's possible, and that we have that sort of human resilience has demonstrated itself. The second is, you know, I think we've really, and various other people have said this, but, you know, I think we've really had another reminder of why science matters. And if you're going to do work on climate change, ultimately it's science-based and science-driven, and we have to believe in it. And we've seen people making decisions about the economy based on epidemiologists giving us scientific projections. And that's actually kind of heartening to those of us who are working data-driven fields. I think we've seen a new understanding that government matters, which is really important. I mean, we're actually providing public service in a way that is critically important in terms of recovery. And I think we're actually seeing all the numbers kind of uptick on government, people trusting in government again more than they have for decades. And that's actually really, really important for the kind of work that we all do. And then just going back and echoing Louise's point and earlier points about kind of compassion and community. And I think that's been demonstrated. And all of these are things that can't go away, I guess, in terms of like what we need to see going forward. It's continuation of all of those things, and just an understanding, as you know, to echo Mark, and something we say a lot all the time too, that we can't bounce back. We have to bounce forward out of this moment and do it in a way that's resilient. So those things give me some hope.
Yeah, definitely echo, you know, the words of Kate and Louise and Mark, and just thanks for such a great panel. To me, you know, a lot of the conversations that I've had with ARCCA over the last several years have been so climate focused, and specifically about building resilience against certain threats, whether it's well-placed coastal wetlands or water conservation or water supply diversification or that fuel break, like the things to protect us from the very specific threats we anticipate with climate. But I think, you know, we've been knocked back on our heels with this global pandemic, and then, you know, once again, you know, well-justified civil unrest. And to me, it suggests sort of three no regrets priorities that we need to double down on. First, improving capacity within our communities to support ourselves and each other, because frankly, we don't know the next, you know, threat or crisis that's going to come, but we know our ability to actually support each other is going to get us through that. And we're learning lessons in real time. Number two, prioritizing equity and reducing the vulnerability of each of our residents. We know that our community is as strong as our ability to protect all of our residents. And when we have parts of our communities or states or nation that are vulnerable, we're vulnerable. And then the third is building cohesion across difference within our communities, again, on the local and state and national level. Where we actually build social cohesion, we strengthen our resilience and reduce our vulnerability. Last point, I think we talk a lot about resilience on the community level. I think we should all just reflect on our own personal resilience right now. This is a really hard time for all of us, and certainly speaking personally for myself, you know, in the last 24 hours to have to explain to a 5-year-old, you know, why we need to be inside by a curfew, and what looting is, and why people are talking about killing. Likewise, why she can't, you know, hug her friend who she sees on the street when we're walking the dog because of the pandemic. I mean, these are remarkable times. And I just think coming out of this, you know, our state, our communities are going to need us more than ever. So I just invite us all to take time for ourselves to maintain our own mental, emotional, physical resilience, because ultimately our ability to stay strong will benefit our collective ability to stay strong. So Julia and company, thanks once again for the opportunity to be here.
And huge thanks to everyone for joining us, to our panelists, and then all of you who are joining us through Zoom. We know how busy your lives are, especially from working from home. So appreciate you spending the last hour and a half with us. And just to close things up, just want to point folks to our online homes for ARCCA and for CAF. We'll be posting the recording up on those websites. We'll also follow up by email for folks who registered. And please stay tuned for our next webinar. And until then, be safe and stay well. And we hope to see you all again soon. And yeah, thanks to all of our panelists again. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.